Also from my Gurudev, he has authored many books in Sanskrit. I started editing them first. So quite a few of my works were initially editing his books, and that's how I thought maybe I should also write, because in this process I've learned so much that I think it's good to share that learning with everyone. So as they say in our tradition, Vyaye krite vardhata eva nityam vidyadhanam sarvadhana pradhanam. On being expensed, the wealth of knowledge increases. It does not go down.
Namaste, I'm Deepthi Rao. Today we have with us NityanAnda Misra ji. NityanAnda Misra is a multifaceted author and a Sanskrit scholar. He is an initiated disciple of Swami Ramabhadracharya. He has edited and authored 8 books in Sanskrit, Hindi, and English, and writes on Indic religions, scriptures, philosophy, culture, and names. He's also an alumnus of IIM Bangalore and has worked as an investment banker with firms like Goldman Sachs, Citi, Morgan Stanley, etc. Namaste, Nityanand ji. Very, very happy to be speaking with you.
Namaste.
Nityanand ji, tell us a little bit about your background and how did you get into writing?
Okay. So my father and my mother both used to write. My father was a scientist with the Indian Council for Agriculture Research, and he used to write many papers in international journals, national journals, and so on. My mother was a short story writer. She used to write many poems, essays, articles, and so on. So growing up in such a household, I was attracted towards writing, but their writing was very different from the kind of writing I did. My personal venture into writing, I think it came during my IIM days when I co-authored a paper with Professor Malay Bhattacharya, and it got published in Quantitative Finance, a peer-reviewed international journal, after 2 rounds of review. So that was an entirely mathematical or statistical work which got published way back in 2009. And I think that was the start of my writing journey. Of course, that was a very different work, but later that publication, I would say, was a trial by fire to get published in an international journal, which is peer reviewed. And I would say that honed my writing skills. And then I combined these newly developed skills with my passion and my interests, and there it started. So my first book came out in 15. Then 2 more books in 2017, and then 2019, 2 more books, another book in 2020, and 2 more came out just recently, 2022. So that's how the journey into writing started. My background, as I mentioned, my father was a scientist with the Indian Council for Agriculture Research. My mother was a school teacher in Kendriya Vidyalaya. I grew up in Junagadh, a very small town, not so small, but a small town compared to the metros in Gujarat. I spent 12 years of my life there. Before that, I was in Meerut, the place, from the 1857 Battle of Independence. But I was very young there. So I'd say Gujarat is where I grew up. And so I speak Gujarati also. Then I studied engineering at Ahmedabad for 4 years, worked in the software industry in Bangalore for a year, then pursued my management degree from IIM Bangalore. And that's how I got into investment banking, Goldman Sachs, then Morgan Stanley, then Citigroup. and currently with CLSA. Writing happened on the side. So
wonderful. So how did you get inspired to write about Sanskrit?
Okay, Sanskrit was something which I learned in my childhood when I used to read the Bhagavad Gita or the Valmiki Ramayana at home. And then I formally studied it at school from grade 5 to grade 12. I remember in my 10th CBSE boards, I wrote the Sanskrit exam. It was an optional subject. I took it as an additional subject, studied it on my own, and I was the only person in the examination hall writing the Sanskrit question paper, answering the Sanskrit question paper. And during my days at IIM Bangalore, I learned more and more about Sanskrit grammar, its mathematical nature, and that's how I got interested in Sanskrit grammar, the Ashtadhyayi of Panini, and then I started reading Kalidasa. I had read Valmiki earlier, but I reread Valmiki after I read Kalidasa, and then a lot many other works. So also from my Gurudev, he has authored many books in Sanskrit. I started editing them first. So quite a few of my works were initially editing his books, and that's how I thought maybe I should also write, because in this process I've learned so much that I think it's good to share that learning with everyone. So as they say in our tradition, Vyaye krite vardhata eva nityam vidyadhanam sarvadhana pradhanam. On being expensed, the wealth of knowledge increases. It does not go down. So that's how the journey started of writing books on Sanskrit, on Indic religions, Indic culture.
Amazing. Tell us a little bit about the books you've written.
The first book I wrote, not the first book I edited. I edited quite a few books before that. The first book I wrote was an annotated and expanded translation of the Mahaviri Hindi commentary on the Hanuman Chalisa, which is one of the most popular prayers of Hindus, especially in northern India. The commentary was originally written by my Gurudeva, Swami Ramabhadracharya ji. I translated it into English, expanded it, and added copious endnotes, added the musical notation, added some appendices, and I published this from my own family publishing house, which I established to publish my books. Incidentally, I also typeset and design my books myself. So all my books that I've written, I've also designed them right from the pagination to the fonts, to the book size, to the crop marks and the bleed, everything. So that was my first book, Mahaviri Hanuman Chalisa Demystified. That came out in 2015. The next one was the Om Mala. This book is on 108 meanings, or rather 109 if you count the Sumeru bead also. So 109 groups of meanings of Om, the mantra, the primordial mantra, and the most sacred word in Hinduism, or even if you consider Buddhism or Jainism or even Sikhism, the Ikonkar. So this book was on one word, Om, and that was published initially in 2016. I'm sorry, 2017, and then again in 2018. So this was published in both English and Hindi, the Om Mala, meanings of the mystic sound, as in English, and Om Mala, Omkar ke Arth in Hindi. That was number 2 and number 3. The next 2 books were on the Kumbh Mela, and this was in time for the 2019 Ardha Kumbh Mela in Prayag. So this was Kumbh, the traditionally modern Mela in English, and Kumbh, Nutan or Puratan ka Mela in Hindi. This book was in 12 chapters because the Kumbh is organized once every 12 years. So I decided to write the book in 12 chapters and covered everything from organization to history to the inclusiveness to how we have music and literature and arts at the Kumbh and so on, and how it's really the very microcosm of Hindus. You find everything in the Kumbh Mela. So that was number 4 and number 5. Then came Sonama, beautiful Sanskrit names. This came in 2020. A short book with 3,000 rare Sanskrit names. And this was just the first step, because I'm also currently compiling the Sonama Sagar, which will have 1 lakh Sanskrit names in 2 volumes. So that was number 6. And number 7 and 8 are the books which were released just recently. Vyasa Katha, Fables from the Mahabharata, that's in English, and Vyasa Katha, Mahabharat ki Niti Kathaएं in Hindi. This book is a compilation of 51 fables or Niti Kathas from the Mahabharata, along with the context, the learnings, and my views on what this Katha teaches us, where else it is found, maybe in the Jatak sources or Panchtantra or Hitopadesh or some of the Puranas. And the aim is to present readers of all ages, including children above 10, teenagers, adults, and the elderly, a source of all the fables that are present in the Mahabharata. Not all, but most of them, which are present in the Mahabharata. And the reason for writing this book was that when it comes to Niti Kathas or fables, those of the Jatakas, the Panchtantra, the Hitopadesh are widely known. But those which are in the Mahabharata are not so widely known. So I decided to write something to bring these tales from the Mahabharata to a wider audience. So these are the 8 books I've edited and authored so far. Translated, edited, and authored. Not edited, so translated or authored, because there are, I think, 6 or 7 more books which I've only edited.
That's amazing. How do you pick topics to write? How do you go about deciding that you should write about this topic next?
Sometimes it's a suggestion from a friend or a reader or a family member. For example, one of my closest friends in the literary world is Manish Modi, who runs a nearly 100-year-old publishing house, the Hindi Granth Karyalay in Mumbai. And a couple of months ago, he requested me to author an English and Hindi translation of the Prakrit grammar, which is the Prakrit Prakasha of a Vararuchi. It's a much smaller grammar compared to the Ashtadhyayi, but a rich source of learning for everybody who is interested in the Prakrits of the ancient era. And a great deal of understanding of Hindi and Marathi comes from any other modern northern languages and Western languages can be gained from this Prakrit grammar. So this suggestion came from a friend. Sometimes if I read about a topic and I think there's enough to write about it and not many people know about it, then I pick up that topic. Sometimes it's by reading some other book that I get inspired and think, okay, this is something on which we should have something more that should be published. So yeah, ideas come from all sources. Sometimes it's people commenting on Facebook or Twitter that, why don't you write a book on this? And so that's probably how Sunama came up. It was due to persistent comments from people on social media that, why don't you write a book on Sanskrit names, which are not
awesome.
very
How do you
commonly
make time
used.
to, you have a thriving career as an investment banker as well, and you're a prolific author. How do you make time for both?
I think the answer lies in the difference between interest and passion. And interest is something which you pursue when you find time. A passion is something to pursue which you find time. So Sanskrit learning or reading about our ancient scriptures or writing, this is a passion for me. So somehow we take time out. Early mornings,
That's
late
awesome.
nights,
Very, very
weekends,
well said.
and so on.
So how long does it typically take for you to, write and publish a book, right from the time when you conceptualize it to the time it gets published?
It could take anywhere from a few months to a few years, depending on which book it is. For example, this one, Vyasakatha, I had initially thought about it way back in 2017, that there should be a book on the fables in the Mahabharata. But then something else or the other kept coming up. But this idea was always there. In fact, out of those 51 fables or kathas which are covered in this book, I think around 20 to 30 I had listed for writing way back in 2017. But then I got busy in other things. And then it was only last year that I came back to this project. And it took me, I think I started in March and I finished in October, both English and Hindi. So combined around 850 pages. So it took around 6-7 months in this case. Sunama Sagar is something which I'm currently working on, and it'll take at least 3 to 4 years because it's a massive work with 1 lakh names across 2 volumes. Sometimes if I've read everything about the topic that I need to, and if I start writing, then it could take even 3 months. That was how Kumbh was written. I had read almost everything I wanted to write, and the book was finished in less than 3 months. So it depends on the kind of book, how much research we need to do. Also, I want to emphasize that often we don't pay, or rather, we don't think much about proofreading, which is a very important step in publishing. This book, Vyasakatha, of course, it was proofread by the editors and the publishing team, but I myself proofread the English draft 4 times and the Hindi draft 3 times. Because when we write books which are non-fiction, I think as a non-fiction author, one should always strive for perfection, that there are no factual errors, no spelling or grammar mistakes, no incoherence, no bad structure. So proofreading takes a lot of time. Sometimes the proofreading can go on for months. So that also takes time. As far as designing the books is concerned, that now it doesn't take me too much time because I have designed more than 20 books to date, all in LaTeX. So that step is easier, and I design the book as I write it. So the first thing we decide is what will be the page size, what will be the font size, what will be the layout. And then when I start writing, I typeset as I write. So that's a parallel process. Then also we have things like the cover design, which again is the cover is something which is what the reader looks at first. So in this case, the cover has a painting, and the book also has around 25 illustrations. So I was working with the artist, Shivani Atri, to get the best painting out for the cover and the illustrations for the book. So all in all, from a few months to a few years, well, we love the process. It's a labor of love. So even if it takes 5 years, I think if for a book like Sunam Sagar, which probably come out in 2025, it's worth the wait and it's worth the time. So I enjoy the whole process, the typesetting, the conceptualizing, the writing, the proofreading, the cover design. Some of my books, I design the covers myself, and getting people to write a foreword or getting back cover blurbs. In this case, in the case of Vyas Katha, there's no foreword or blurbs on the back cover, but often you see in books there's a foreword. So we think about who's the most suited to write a foreword to this book, and which authors do you approach for the back cover, for the blurbs there.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And definitely like a lot of passion and persistence that go into publishing all the books, besides enormous research. So we're really, really grateful to have you publish all these books and make all this knowledge more accessible to people that probably wouldn't have learned about all these topics that you write about otherwise. So switching gears a little bit. So you were a self-taught Sanskrit scholar. So we'd love to know, how is Sanskrit unique as a language?
I call myself a learner and a student of Sanskrit, not a scholar. So I'm still learning, and this will continue till the end of my, end of this life. So how is Sanskrit unique as a language? I think across all the languages I know English, Hindi, Gujarati, German, Marathi, parts of Kannada. I can understand Bangla. So across the 6 or 7 languages that I know, I may not speak them, but I can understand and I can read and write. So across these, and from what I've read about other languages, I think Sanskrit is probably the most structured and mathematical language that has ever existed. Just the fact that the grammar of Sanskrit is kind of a context-sensitive grammar, which is these 2 phonemes in certain conditions result in this, or this root, when suffixed by these set of suffixes, undergoes this transformation. So all these transformations, really the Prakriti Pratyaya Vibhag, which is splitting a word into the root, the suffixes, the prefixes, and what sense each of these components conveys, all that is phenomenally analyzed in the Ashtadhyayi of Panini. Even when we look at the Maheshwar Sutras, there's a PhD thesis by a German lady, Wiebke Peterson, on the Maheshwara Sutras. And the thesis proves that the arrangement of those letters in the Shiva Sutras or Maheshwara Sutras is nearly optimal or nearly optimal. And this had a chance of 1 in millions. So that kind of arrangement with the codes of pratyahars, or what you call the markers, the markers and the pratyahars, which are like codes for a collection of letters, all that is the work of a very highly evolved mind. In fact, a lot of people have said that the Sanskrit grammar is probably the pinnacle of human intelligence. So this is something which I find is unique about Sanskrit, that the structure, the mathematical nature, and the immense possibilities it has with the samas and the sandhi process is great. We have things like a sapta sandhana kavya or a pancha sandhana kavya in Sanskrit, where the same verse reveals 5 different or 7 different meanings. It's the same sequence of sounds, but just how you interpret the words differently or split the compounds different, it reveals multiple meanings. And people have written a dvisandhana kavya or a panchasandhana kavya or a saptasandhana kavya. And this is probably possible only in a language like Sanskrit, which has such an ingrained mathematical nature to it. Interestingly, if you look at things like Pascal's triangle or the Fibonacci sequence, they are both present in the Chanda Shastra, which is the branch of prosody, Sanskrit poetics, which is based on the short and long letters, Laghu and Guru, the light and heavy syllables. Even the binary system, we see in many ancient cultures, there are roots of the binary system, including the Chanda Shastra of Pingala, who says that there are 8 kinds of triplets of Guru and Laghu. So 2 raised to 3 is 8. And that's the binary system inherent in Pingala's Chanda Shastra. So De Bruyn sequence, binary system, Pascal's triangle, Fibonacci sequence, all these ideas were present in Sanskrit poetics. I will come to another interesting aspect, the knight's tour on a chessboard. It's a well-known problem and a long history of knight's tours on different kind of boards. There is a specific kind of chitra kavya or image poetry in Sanskrit, which is Turaga Padabandha. Turaga, as we know, means a horse, and the Turaga Padabandha means Turaga Padabandha means a bandha or an arrangement which follows the steps of a knight on a chessboard. So Turag means a horse, but in the context of Chaturanga or chess, it means the piece which is called knight today, which is still shaped like a horse, if you see. So Rudrat, in his work on Kavya Lankar, cites a verse, or rather explains a verse where the verse is the same if you go in the sequence. So Anushtup verse is 32 syllables, 8 syllables in every quarter. So 8 into 4 is 32. And then if we arrange these 32 syllables in 4 lines of 8 each, you kind of have a chessboard with half a chessboard with 32 squares. And what this Turaga-pada bandha is that there are different types of it, but one of the types is that the verse reads the same if you go in the sequence, so the first row, second row, third row, and the fourth row, or if you start from the first syllable in the first row and then follow the movement of a knight on half a chessboard and then cover all these squares. So the verse is the same in both these sequences. So this is an amazing example of a knight's tour on half a chessboard. And this is first done in a Sanskrit verse. Even Vedanta Deshika in his Paduka Sahasra has an example of a Turagapada Bandha. And we often see that great Sanskrit scholars are also good chess players. An example that comes to mind is Ambikadatta Vyasa, whose Katha Kusumam I'm currently rendering as videos for introductory Sanskrit. And Ambikadatta Vyasa was a phenomenal extempore poet in Sanskrit, Braj Bhasha, Hindi, many languages. He was also a great chess player. So he wrote a book called Chaturanga Chaturi, which in Sanskrit means the expertise in playing chess. And he had 8 or 12 knights tours on different kind of boards in that book. Even in recent times, Shivaram Dattatreya Joshi or SD Joshi, who's one of the most prolific scholars of Ashtadhyayi and Sanskrit grammar, passed away some years ago. He was known to be a great chess player. So the way Sanskrit grammar is structured, the way the language is structured, it kind of develops your mathematical thinking. And that's what explains people like Ambikadatta Vyasa or SD Joshi being great chess players. So these are things which are unique about, I think, which are unique about Sanskrit, a very mathematical approach to things. And as Carl Friedrich Gauss once said, mathematics is the queen of the sciences. So I think the mathematical mind or the scientific mind is naturally attracted to a language like Sanskrit. So if you like something like algebra, you like Sanskrit. You like Sanskrit grammar. It's something I've personally experienced, and this is
that's really fascinating. So typically Sanskrit, at least in the current generation, views Sanskrit as a more ancient language with little practical purpose. How do we revive and make the current generation aware of the beauty of this language?
So I kind of disagree. Why is Sanskrit of little practical purpose? Do we say music is of little practical purpose? What problems does music solve? Does it alleviate poverty or hunger or global warming? No. But we don't say music is not of any practical purpose. What problem does the game of chess solve? Does it alleviate all the problems of the world or international tensions? Or does it remove space junk? Or is it a vaccine for coronavirus? No. So things like chess or music or arts, these are not something where you evaluate their utility by what is in it for us today. But these are things which are part of our culture. Languages, arts, music. So it's not of little or no utility. It's in fact our identity. If you think about names, your name is Deepti, a beautiful Sanskrit word. My name is NityanAnda. Most of the people, even today in India, have Sanskrit names. When we talk about scientific or mathematical terminology, if we have to teach science or maths in Indian languages, where do we get the terms from? Where do we get the term for, say, photosynthesis or the law of gravity or laws of motion? You'll find that except for Urdu, in most major Indian languages, the terms are borrowed from Sanskrit, except perhaps for Tamil, which uses a lot of native words for modern concepts like, say, normal distribution or photosynthesis, probably. But apart from Urdu and Tamil, in most major Indian languages, we rely on Sanskrit for technical terms, for mathematical terms. So how is it useless?
So how do we revive the need and importance of Sanskrit? And how do we make people aware of the beauty and the depth of Sanskrit? Everything that you mentioned that was unique about the language. I don't think many people are very familiar with that.
I think we just explain how things are and bring such things to light. There's a great book by NityanAnda Misra. It's co-authored by him, The Wonder That Was Sanskrit. And I see these days quite a few Twitter handles, Facebook accounts, YouTube channels are promoting Sanskrit, bringing to light the wonders of Sanskrit and what is unique about the language. So we need to make people aware using these modern tools like social media and the age-old tools like books, articles, speeches, that Sanskrit is a language which has a lot more than what people think it has. Ancient Indian knowledge, a source of all scientific and mathematical terms which we use today. If not all, then most scientific and mathematical terms which we use in Indian languages today. And a source of almost all our names in India, except for, some communities. Most names in India are still Sanskrit names. So it is a language which we have an everyday connect with. Any religious rite in Hindus has some Sanskrit in it. So if today somebody performs a Griha Pravesh or an Annaprashana Samskara or a Vivaha Samskara, Sanskrit is invariably there. Now, as I also want to talk about a recent controversy which happened in Karnataka, where people and some Kannada organizations were opposed to a Sanskrit university. And I found it a bit ironical because as per some Kannada lexicographers and scholars, around 70% of words in Kannada have their roots in Sanskrit. So how can there be an opposition between these two languages? If a state gives funds to Sanskrit, how is that detrimental or harmful to the state's language? In the case of most major Indian languages, except for the languages, let's say in the Northeast or in the Andamans, or some tribal languages, most major languages in India borrow heavily from Sanskrit. And so how can Sanskrit be opposed to any language? Even Urdu borrows 70% of its vocabulary, as per Urdu lexicographers, from Sanskrit and Prakrit. So I don't see any opposition between major Indian languages and Sanskrit. If you look at Tamil Nadu, as once looking at the names of all members of Legislative Assembly, and I found that most of the names, 70%, 80%, have roots in Sanskrit. Yesterday, there was a news item about the first metaverse wedding in India, and the bride's name is Janaganandini, which is Janakanandini. It's a Sanskrit name. So how can we be detached from Sanskrit when it's a part of our living culture? You just can't separate somebody from their very breath.
Very true. So how deep is the political angle in trying to replace Sanskrit words in Hindi with Urdu? You can see that there are a lot of Hindi, like you mentioned, 70-80% of the words in Hindi have roots in Sanskrit. Yeah, and
Urdu vocabulary.
Urdu is in Sanskrit.
Urdu, 70 or 80% of Urdu words come from Sanskrit and Prakrit. I don't know if there's a political angle. There's certainly a kind of superiority complex, which is a manufactured superiority complex around Urdu in India. So if you look at Bollywood movies, a person who speaks Sanskrit-rich Hindi is often a comedian. Like, think about the character of Dharmendra in Chupke Chupke. And a person who speaks Urdu-laced Hindi is shown in a positive light. So it's more about, I would say, a misplaced superiority complex about Urdu and a misplaced inferiority complex about Sanskrit, which is an undertone in many Bollywood movies. In fact, if you look at the Urdu poets of early 19th century or 18th century, their Urdu is not as rich in Persian or Arabic words as the Urdu of Mirza Ghalib, who was in the 19th century, or the Urdu that's spoken on Pakistani news channels today. So what we have seen is, over time, Urdu, over time, getting more and more Persian words, and recently, in the last few decades, the Arabicization of Urdu. The Persian words are now being replaced by Arabic words. As an example, Khuda Hafiz is now being replaced by Allah Hafiz, because by some speakers, because Khuda is a Persian word and Allah is an Arabic word. So what we have seen on one side is Urdu getting detached, more and more detached from its very root, which is Sanskrit and Prakrit, and going towards Persian and Arabic. As for Hindi, they may have been one language a long time back, but today they are definitely two different languages, because we have Hindi Urdu dictionaries. There's one right behind me. If they were one language, as some people claim to be, then why would there be an Hindi Urdu or Urdu Hindi dictionary? For Hindi, using more Prakrit or Sanskrit words is just going back to its roots. So I don't think if there's a political angle to it, but definitely if we talk about, for example, very recently, yesterday, the Madhya Pradesh police had a circular. The Madhya Pradesh police headquarters issued a circular and said that we want to replace obsolete Persian and Urdu terms, which nobody understands today, but are still used in official police records. And they're compiling a list of such words. If you go and find an FIR in, say, even Delhi or in Madhya Pradesh, the official police documents use words which even no Urdu speaker in India would understand. These are like obsolete Persian words. Why are we using them? So it's a welcome move to replace them with Hindi words or Sanskrit words, which is more in line with what we speak today and how our language has evolved with time. But even here, people will say, "Oh, this is nationalism. This is BJP versus Congress, this or that." So politics somehow invariably comes in when you talk about languages. When I talk about Sanskrit-rich Hindi, I say a Sanskrit-rich Hindi is closer to its roots and is also a greater unifying force than Hindustani or Urduized Hindi. If we look at Western India, Southern India, and Eastern India, people who don't have Hindi as a mother tongue can still understand Sanskrit-rich Hindi fairly easily compared to Hindi, which is laced with a lot of Persian and say Arabic words or Urdu words. So that's my perspective. When we look at Bollywood has a great, opportunity to influence people, but then Bollywood also has a very big market outside India, in the Middle East, to our west, to our east. So they have to reach a large number of people who are used to Urdu or Hindi with a lot of Persian Arabic words. But if we look at India alone, and if we want to have a linked language, and if that linked language has to be Hindi, then it can only be a Sanskritized or Sanskrit-rich Hindi. even in the Constitution of India, it is mentioned that to develop Hindi, it will be primarily relying on Sanskrit and other Indian languages. So to develop Hindi as a language, what the Constitution of India says is we need to borrow words from Sanskrit and other Indian languages. So that's my take. If we have to, Sanskrit obviously is a great unifying language. Prakrit is a great unifying language. There's so many words if you find in even Kannada and Telugu today, which have their source in Prakrit, and the similar words exist in say Punjabi or Rajasthani or Gujarati or Marathi. So Sanskrit is a unifying language. Prakrit is a unifying language. Hindi is a unifying language. And of course, if you look at, let's say, our national anthem, that's in Sanskritized Bengali. It's not Sanskrit, it's not Bengali, it's not the Bengali that's spoken on the street. It's not Hindi, it's Sanskritized Bengali. But because it's Sanskrit rich Bengali, we understand it. So if you know Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka Jaya He, you get the sense of it, because even though it's Bengali, you understand the Sanskrit words there. So just like our national anthem, which is in Sanskritized Bengali, I think a Sanskrit-rich Hindi has a greater potential of unifying or being a link language than Hindustani or Urduized Hindi.
Nityanandji, what is the state of Sanskrit education in India today? Why is it important for children to learn Sanskrit?
The state of Sanskrit education in India today, it has improved in the recent times. We have had quite a few Sanskrit universities which were established in the last few years. I would say in the last 15 to 20 years, we've had quite a few Sanskrit universities. On the other hand, we also see some Sanskrit departments in some universities struggling, for example, in the Punjab University. So it's a mixed bag, but I'm very hopeful that with the digital content we are creating, for example, Doordarshan now broadcasts a weekly 30-minute program entirely in Sanskrit. They broadcast a 5-minute news bulletin every day. And we have very good poets, scholars, grammarians becoming active on social media, creating more and more video content and audio content. So I'm quite hopeful that this will improve in the future. We have a great many publications coming out. Some of the tallest scholars of Sanskrit have produced, for example, Pushpa Dikshit or Pandit Ishwar Chandra or Shatabdhani Ganesh have produced so many works, Radha Vallabh Tripathi, which gives us hope that Sanskrit is still alive and we have the tradition of scholarship very much alive today. Why is it important for children to learn Sanskrit? I think it's to get them closer to their roots, their cultural roots. So when we have children who learn Sanskrit, they learn in the case of most major Indian languages, they learn their mother tongue better if they learn Sanskrit. If they know where these words come from, where certain idioms come from, they know their own language better. And as the prolific Hindi poet Bharatendu Harishchandra said in the 19th century, that the root of all progress is advancement in one's own mother tongue. So he wrote a couplet in Braj Bhasha, which was Nij Bhasha Unnati Ahe, Sab Unnati Ko Mool. The root of all progress is progress or advancement in one's own mother tongue, because that is the language we speak in, that's the language we think in, that's the language we express ourselves in most often. And with a better understanding of the mother tongue, a person becomes better at expressing his thoughts and at understanding expressions and works in his own language. So that's why, because Sanskrit is linked so closely with major Indian languages, it's important for children to learn the language, to know more about their culture, to know more about their history, to know more about their own mother tongue, know more about the arts, know more about the literature in the country, and so on.
Nityananji, how do you think we can get children interested in learning Sanskrit beyond a pure academic interest?
I think one of the best ways to teach Sanskrit or any language is stories, tales, or kathas. And the origin of Niti kathas or fables is India. They originate from Vedic texts, the Upanishads, and then later the Jatakas, the Panchtantra, and the Hitopdesha. So these are the kind of stories which will get children interested. What I'm doing currently is a series of videos on introductory Sanskrit through short stories, which are fables. Some of them, the famous fables, for example, the fox and the sour grapes. So these fables, rendered in Sanskrit, simple Sanskrit, with an explanation in Hindi or English or in the mother tongue, makes it more interesting. There is a great deal of Bala Sahityam, or literature for children. There's a book which I think NityanAnda Misra ji has written. There are poems which Abhiraj Rajendra Mishra, Triveni Kavi, has written. And even the NCRT books on Sanskrit, 6th standard onwards, make it interesting with photographs, with illustrations, with interesting sentences. And what will be good is if you can supplement this with simple conversational videos in Sanskrit, simple sentences or simple plays. For example, how do you associate a word and its meaning? There's one way, which is you learn a language by reading. But that is not as strong a learning, in my opinion, as when you learn a language by listening and speaking. Right? For example, let's say if I tell you how to ask somebody for water in Sanskrit. So I'll say Jalam Anaya. Jalam is water. Anaya, may you please bring. So if I write this in a book, people will read it, people will forget it. But if you watch a video, a movie, or better still, if you experience this in real life, that somebody says Jalamanaya and the other person brings a glass of water, think about how strong that learning is. You associate the words Jalamanaya with bringing water, and that is how a child initially learns languages, by associating actions with words. So when we take a child out in the night and say, look at the stars, or in Hindi, dekho tare. So if you say this in Sanskrit, Pashya Tarakan, how strong is that? So I think with such kinds of videos or books with illustrations, for example, a book which gives you the names of animals or birds or things of day-to-day use with photographs, with illustrations, I think that's a good way to start from a very young age. And then fables or niti kathas, something which I am currently experimenting with, the Samarambha series of my YouTube videos is teaching introductory Sanskrit through Hindi or English using short stories, kathas. Along with this, audios, videos, and all this is an effective way of teaching a language. And today we can do this in a much easier way because of the proliferation of digital media. It takes no time to produce a video, put it out on YouTube, and for people to watch it. In earlier times, think about how you would teach Sanskrit to children. You would either publish books, which is a lengthy process, or if it was in an audiovisual way, then have a troupe of artists who would perform a play. Think of how much time that would take and how much reach it would have. So today, I think with digital media, with the ease of publishing digitally, especially videos, we have much more power to communicate an idea or to teach a language in an effective way to young children. And I hope we make
What can the government do to impart Sanskrit education at scale?
I think more than the government, it is something on the people, because the government has their own, they have their own priorities. Winning elections is one for the party in power, and appeasing people is another. And of course, the governments, the central government and also the state governments, they are doing their bit to promote Sanskrit, for example, by establishing Sanskrit universities or bestowing scholarships, or even Doordarshan is doing its part by broadcasting probably the only weekly news magazine on TV. And it's been doing it for years. So, plus the daily bulletin I mentioned. So they're doing their part, but I think it's more about the universities. And more than the government, I think Sanskrit Bharati has done a phenomenal job. The way they have reached people all across the country, started conversational Sanskrit camps, they have got people interested. Not only that, they have published books of scholars like Janardhan Hegde or Pushpa Dikshit. So it's, since the language is essentially a way for people to connect with each other, I think it's more about how we collectively take up this cause than just the government. Yes, it could be a public-private partnership. It could be something with the support of the government. But in my opinion, rather than looking towards the government, I think if the initiative comes from us, from people like us, and we take it forward, then it'll be more effective.
So what is your advice for anyone that wants to learn Sanskrit and does not have access to a teacher? Like, what are some of the best avenues to start learning Sanskrit?
There are books, and I covered some of these books in a video of mine. For example, one thing I always recommend is, if you want to learn Sanskrit, then please do it through your mother tongue. The first priority should be through one's mother tongue. And if that is not possible, then through English. Rather than that, if the first priority should be mother tongue, next, another Indian language, and after that, English. So if you can learn Sanskrit through, say, Marathi or Bangla or Kannada, that is the best. Or Hindi, that's the best. If not, then some other Indian language, if you're comfortable with it. And finally, if none of these options is possible, then through English. There are quite a few good books. For example, there is the Sanskrit Swayam Shikshaka of Shripada Damodar Satavalekar. This book is through Hindi. There are the Anuvada Chandrikas, the Naveen Anuvada Chandrika, and the Brihadanvada Chandrika, 2 books I highly recommend for learning Sanskrit through Hindi. There are several books to learn through Marathi or Gujarati or other Indian languages, and also through English. So books is still an effective medium. The other way is to listen to the news bulletin broadcast by Doordarshan every day. It's a 5-minute bulletin, and it gives you the news in a nutshell, the daily happenings, national and international news. The transcripts, I think, are available. The audio files and I believe the videos are also available. I think the videos are not, the audio files are. Then the weekly news magazine on Doordarshan, which is a half-an-hour program, Vartavali. They make it interesting by using a combination of news plus featuring a person plus some subhashita. So watching such programs will help. Watching certain YouTube channels, especially YouTube channels teaching Sanskrit through English or Hindi or your mother tongue would help. And once we start with this, then I always recommend reading the Valmiki Ramayana. That is one work which is not reading that with a good translation, if available in one's mother tongue or in some other Indian language or English. So, for example, if you start with the works of, say, Kalidasa, they are difficult to understand for a beginner. But the language of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata is not that complex. There are no long compound words or convoluted expressions that we find in Mahakavyas or the works of later poets. But the poetry of Valmiki is like water. It's so natural. You drink it, and that's it. It gives you life. It gives you comfort, and it's so natural. Your body is so used to it. So the poetry of Valmiki is something which, if people can read, that'll give them a very good start towards learning Sanskrit.
That's awesome. I think those were really, really great tips. And I think our viewers would find it very useful, especially the ones that are planning to learn Sanskrit as well.
Also, the conversational camps organized by Sanskrit Bharati, they are quite good. They do offer many courses, and these are dedicated volunteers who would come to your place if you have enough people and teach you Sanskrit. So I think that would also help. Sanskrit Bharati has done phenomenal work, and they need our support. And the least we can do is by buying their books or organizing their programs or giving them more visibility for them to do the great work they're doing.
Thank you, Nityanandji. Any closing thoughts for our viewers?
Nothing specific that comes to mind, but I would say please do support Sanskrit. It is our common heritage. It is our identity. It is the language from where most of Indians get their names from. It is the language that is the source of most words in most of the major languages spoken in the country. So it is our collective responsibility to not only preserve this language, but also learn from it, gain from it, and further advance its cause.
Very, very rightly put. Thank you so much, Nityanandji. This was a pleasure. very, very informative and educative video. And looking forward to reading all your books, and looking forward to seeing what all you do next in this vast field. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste.